Good evening. I'm glad to be back with you guys tonight. The title of tonight's lesson, covering Deuteronomy 2:2 through 3:11, the title is Faith or Arrogance, Living Under the Sovereignty of God. And so last week we covered the Exodus generation's chance to leave the purposeless existence of the desert and claim the inheritance that Yahweh had promised to them. They had the chance to begin to live out what it meant to be the covenant people of Yahweh. Their failure to remember what God had done, though, and their choice to instead focus on all the challenges that were in front of them, paralyzed them with fear. And the consequence for their lack of faith is that God will give them what they wanted. They won't go in. They don't have to go in. In fact, they can't go in, and they will die in the desert. We didn't have time for the last two parts. Thankfully, the next part is Moses telling them he also won't get to go into the promised land, but because Moses decides to mention that 2 more times in the upcoming chapters, we're going to cover it again then. The last part that we didn't get to cover is when the people, not only did they refuse to obey God, then they refused to accept the consequences for their disobedience, and they're like, all right, we're going to strap on our swords and here we go. And despite Moses being like, that's a really bad idea, they do it anyway. And when they get to the land that is flowing with milk and honey, instead of being able to enjoy the honey, the land turns on them and they are chased, Moses says, like a swarm of bees. The land turns on them because the gift of the land was given with only one prerequisite: faith. Believe that I have given it to you and go do it. And the Israelites, when they went on their ill-advised and self-directed attack, it wasn't an attack based on faith. It was not an act of faith, but an act of arrogance, that they could claim for themselves what God had promised, even though they had refused to act based on faith before. Acting on faith and claiming stuff for the promise of God out of your own willfulness or sinfulness or fear of the consequences for your previous disobedience isn't an act of faith. It's just an act of arrogance. And their fate is the desert. And that's why I chopped it off at 2:1, because 2:1 really ends that section. It tells us, then we turned around and headed back across the wilderness toward the Red Sea. And we wandered around in the region for a long time. And by long time, he means 38 years they're stuck in this desert. For everyone 20 years and older, the remainder of their days are going to be spent in the desert. And this desert is like a liminal space. And if the word liminal space or liminality is new to you, it's something that you have experienced. It's a phrase, it's a concept of time, which means like it's in between. It's existence of a period after something has ended, but before something new has started. For some, it might be the period between a doctor ordering just a few tests and waiting for the results, or the results and the treatment finally being over. It might be a period of unemployment or grieving. And something less negative, liminal space, is like college. You're not a kid anymore. You're not an adult. You're existing in this weird in-between world. Engagement or pregnancy, escrow, are all liminal spaces where you're kind of just like hanging in the balance. This has started or ended, but this hasn't come to be yet. Liminal space is when in our lives the days and the weeks and the months and the years even are ticking by, but our life seems to hang in suspension. Everyone else's life is moving on. Everyone else is doing things, but we're just stuck waiting for the next thing to happen. And part of the grief of the Israelites' self-appointed fate that they brought on themselves is this consequence of having to live out their days without getting to live, with knowing that their camping wasn't going to end, knowing that they were never going to grow crops again. They were never going to taste real food again. They would never go hungry. They would never go thirsty. But they were never going to live into that purpose for which Moses showed up and says, your God says it's time to become his covenant people and move into the land. So for the Israelites, they lived in liminal space for 38 years because the older generation, unlike Alexander Hamilton, threw away their shots. But then Moses begins this next section, and he uses the same words he'd said to the previous chapter in the previous to the previous generation in the previous chapter. What he had said to them at Sinai, what God had said, it's been long enough, get going. The next generation gets their shot, and Moses is just hoping that they are young, scrappy, and hungry enough to do what their parents and grandparents could not. When I was first reading this chapter, I'm like, okay, so I'll be able to make up what I left behind in the previous one because it's kind of a boring chapter. And when you look at the surface, it's a bunch of names and it's a bunch of places. And if I asked any one of you to read it out loud, you'd be like, please, no, thank you. It's just a long travel log, it seems, of places. And some of them we can identify historically and some we can't. And some people groups we can identify and some we can't. And then if you try and trace it back on what the accounts we have in Numbers, they don't always line up. So then you're trying to harmonize it. But this chapter really isn't about where they went and when. Because remember, Moses' purpose here isn't just to give some sort of straightforward history. These people have just lived it in the recent past. So his purpose of saying, and then we went here, and then we went there, isn't just to remind them where they went. If you guys go on vacation and you're telling someone or you're talking to each other, oh, and then we went there, it's not just to remember the points along the map that you went. It's because the points along the map have memories and they meant something. Moses is drawing to mind what God has done for the Israelites among something they haven't encountered in a few years, which is other people. In fact, in this chapter plus 11 verses, we meet 5 groups of people, 4 nations, and then the Amorites under King Sihon and King Og. And through it all, what Moses is laying the foundation for this generation of Israelites, for all generations of Israelites who will look back on this and gain their history and their purpose and their identity from this text. And for all of us who follow behind and claim this book as our sacred text, he's laying a foundation of the sovereignty of God over all peoples. The first lesson Moses teaches the people about sovereignty of God is that Yahweh is the supreme God, which might seem like an obvious note for us, but was really kind of revolutionary for these people. And he does it first by hanging a big do not disturb sign on 3 of the nations that they're going to encounter, Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Now what these 3 nations all have in common is they're actually relatives of Israel, but that's not the reason God tells them to leave them alone. If you look in the text, he tells them, leave them alone because I've given them their land. That's his reason. You aren't going to fight them and you're not going to take what's theirs because what they have, I gave to them. God is proclaiming that even for nations who do not worship him, he's in charge of them, that he has given them what is theirs. And for an ancient culture, this is what? Because the way that deity worked back then was that each nation had their god or gods, but there was one patron deity who was in charge of this land, and he gave the land to the people, and in turn they worshipped him mostly by serving him and providing his temple with things. And it was like this scratching each other's backs. It was a symbiotic relationship where we each do stuff for each other, and you protect us and give us this land as reward for us taking care of you. And then the nation next to you would also have a god, and you would believe that God existed, but that God gave them their land. And then if nations fought, it wasn't just a battle between people, it was a battle between gods. And whatever god came out as victorious, that people group became victorious, and they got to, move in or take over or do what they wanted with the new land. But when that people group moved in, a lot of times they weren't kicking the old god out because they believed he existed. They would still usually worship and honor him. And we see this throughout the Old Testament. For example, when the Ark of the Covenant is taken in battle, they take it and put it in the temple of their god. Yes, to show his subservience, but they're also going to worship him. And then some crazy things happen and they kick him back out and they're like, no, we do not want this guy. And it happens with the Babylonians, and as various empires come in, when they sack the temple, they're not just doing it to desecrate the temple, they are also taking back items of worship. So they themselves will worship this God, because the last thing you want to do is have a God who's just angry all the time because you're not worshiping and serving him. So defeated gods aren't just defeated because they don't exist. They're defeated because they're less than, but they're kept in kind of the pantheon, and we just want to keep everybody happy so that our lives are as calm and stable as possible. And here is Yahweh saying, yeah, that's wrong, I'm in charge of them all. Like, I know the Moabites worship Chemosh, but I'm actually in charge of it. Monotheism is not a concept that exists in the world at this time. And it's not going to really come out for centuries. And even the Israelites who are being led into this aren't going to grasp this concept. But Moses is telling them, and he's in chapter 4, if we skip ahead in verse 39, he tells them, so remember this and keep it firmly in mind. Yahweh is God, both in heaven and on earth, and there is no other. And he is proving this point from the beginning by saying, yep, Moab and Ammon and Edom, I gave them that land. That's from me. I kicked out the giants. Don't you love that little editorial note that we're reminded, like, giants lived there? Because remember what the Israelites were scared of? The giants. So he's done it before, and what he has done before, he can do again. The development of the monotheism will continue throughout the Bible as they finally try and get a grasp on it. Daniel, in chapter 2 of the book of Daniel, he's exiled to Babylon, and he has come to, we get one of the best statements of kind of the authority that God has, that even while he is in exile, far away from the temple, far away from the presence of God, dwells, he says in chapter 2, verses 21, that Yahweh is the one who changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and he establishes kings. He is sitting under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. He is sitting in the region of Marduk, who has just defeated his kingdom, and he's saying, nope, it is still Yahweh's. It is still my God, because he remembers the words of Moses, who said, there is no other. But all kings, regardless of who they worship, regardless of what obedience and morality they have, they've all been put there by God. And finally, Paul, also living under a foreign power, a ruling Roman emperor who themselves would declare themselves as part deity, he also says that all authority comes from God, and those in positions of authority have been placed there by God. And this idea that God is sovereign over it all, no matter how they're dealing with the power and authority they have been given, God is still over it all. And he gives boundaries, and he gives power, and he takes it away. And he is a God who's working for a good purpose through it all, like the mastermind playing Risk with 20 different things going all at the same time. And so we can rest in the sovereignty, but we also must avoid thinking we know what he's doing with each piece on that Risk board, with each piece on that chessboard. God has put each piece where he wants it, and we have to trust that what he has done, he will do for good in the end. And that is an act of faith on our part. The second thing we learned about God's sovereignty in this chapter, and that the Israelites will have to learn very quickly, is that covenant relationship doesn't mean you get dibs. Can you imagine how this feels like, hey, we're your special people, you made a covenant with us, you saved us from slavery, you're taking us to this land, and now they're told, you can't touch this land, and if you want something to eat, you got to pay for it. And they're like, oh. And he's like, I gave that to them, and I'm not taking it away to give it to you. And it's like, well, I mean, I thought we had a special relationship here. Like, don't I get to choose where I want to go? Because here's the thing, the land that Moab and the Moabites and the Ammonites live in, it's a good land. It's in the Jordan Valley. The one thing, we live in like a rainforest here in East Tennessee. I'm from central Illinois or northern Illinois, which is very fertile, stuff grows. But over there, stuff doesn't always just grow wherever. It doesn't always rain. River valleys is where you get lots of water. Water is really important for helping things grow. And if you read in your homework, he had you reading back through the story of Lot. So the Moabites and the Ammonites descend from Lot. And Lot got his land because he was Abraham's nephew, and they're herders and they're their herds and the people who worked for them, they were getting in fights all the time because they had too much. And so Abraham took Lot up onto a hill and said, look around, tell me what land you want. And he looks at the valley and he's like, that's some good land. That's what I want. And that's what his descendants get, is this good, fertile valley. And so I can imagine as they're coming up to this valley, they're like, well, that'd be nice to have too. And God's like, no. That your privileged position as my child doesn't mean you get to just choose like a spoiled child of a rich father, whatever you want. What I have given, and you will get yours and you'll be happy with it. And we don't have to be that bitter, like, fine, I'll settle. Because what God has is enough for everybody and is good enough for his good purposes and plans. The other thing about that covenant relationship, they don't get dibs. And they're also required to pay the nations for the food and water as they travel. They're not allowed to trample on what God has given other people. In other words, because of their privileged position, God requires his people to treat others with greater respect, not less. We are the people of God, but what everybody has also been given them by God. And he has given it to them, and it is not up to us to decide that we can take it and lay claim to what belongs to others in God's name. If we lay claim to what God and his sovereignty has granted to others, that is not faith, but once again, arrogance. And we shouldn't be surprised if we too are swarmed by bees. It is but it is a long and strong tradition in Christianity to decide to take these texts of conquest that we're coming up to and take it to mean that, hey, we bear God's name, so our calling and responsibility is to go lay claim to the nations in God's name. And we get things like the Crusades, and we get things like colonialism. And instead of the sweet aroma of our beautiful God being spread abroad, the name of God bears the stink of oppression and slavery and death. Because in our arrogance, we have decided to lay claim to what God has given to others. The other ironic thing, I guess, about this privileged people with a special relationship moving through lands that they don't get and don't belong to them and they can't call dibs on is also that even when they're met with disrespect and hostility, they are still beholden to God's commands. The thing that Moses leaves out of this story, if you go back and read in Numbers when they actually encounter Edom, is that he sends a letter to their king and says, hey, relatives, hey, bro, what's up? So we're trying to get to the land that we get. You've got yours. We're going to ours. We just want to walk through on the highway, and we're going to pay you for food. We're going to pay you for water. We won't sleep in your fields. Like, just let us come on through on the king's highway. And they're like, no. And they're like, call up the men at the border. They're like, you come in here, we're going to kill you. And so that's why in the section we read, it says like they bypassed it. And that's like a little weird. Like they were supposed to go through it and be kind. Instead they bypassed it because they have to go around because they can't go through. They're not allowed to fight these people for the right to go through. They have to go around. So in respecting God's commands and respecting what he has given to others, it requires a great amount of inconvenience and extra travel for the Israelites. But they are still beholden to do that. And then Moab, they're gonna, not only do they get cranky with them, they concoct a whole scheme to prevent the Israelites from getting into the promised land. They're the ones who hire Balaam, if you guys remember the story of Balaam, who's hired to curse the Israelites. And he's the guy who can't curse them and he keeps blessing them and they're like, can you just shut your mouth? He's like, no, I can't really, it just keeps coming out. And eventually they'll go in with the Midianites and concoct this plan that will cause the Israelites to sin and suffer death. But even then, when God will tell them later, the Midianites need to be punished for what they did, the Moabites are not punished. And that is one of the things of the sovereignty of God, of why he chooses that they're allowed to, in some respects, get away with it. But if you look forward to why didn't they crush Moab and just take their land? There's going to be a famine in Jerusalem in a couple hundred years, and this family is going to need to go somewhere where there's bread. And so they're going to move to Moab, and then the sons are going to die, and the daughter's going to die. And she's going to be stuck with a daughter-in-law who's going to move home with her, and that daughter-in-law's name is Ruth. And then Ruth, a couple generations later, is going to have a son, great-grandson who's in trouble, and he needs to hide from a really angry king, so he's going to send his family to be safe in the land of Moab. So the Israelites might have been thinking, listen, I know we weren't supposed to touch them, but come on, God, like look what they did to our people. It was bad. He's like, no. I got chess pieces in play, hundreds of years in advance that you can't see. And this is going to be the good, because we need Ruth to come to Israel. We need David to be born. We need to keep David's family safe, so the line from which your ultimate Savior is going to come is protected. We can't see that far. We can't see with that lens. So we just have to trust that in God's sovereignty, the commands he has made, what he has given to people that we don't like, people who are hostile to us, are still always working for purposes and plans that are good, that are moving God's covenant forward, and that are moving us towards new creation. The third thing that God, through Moses, is teaching the Israelites in chapter 2 about his sovereignty is that God's sovereignty works in conjunction with human agency. Obviously, when these people groups, when the Edomites, Moabites, Ammonites, and Amorites came into these lands, they fought for them. They did. So it's not just like we all sit passively by and God just is like handing out things like we're, sitting going through the school lunch line. And the Israelites are required more than most to come together with God in faith to be his people when he's asking them to do something. And in the middle of chapter 2, they get another direction, and this is it. Get moving. Cross the Zered Brook. And Moses, he really emphasizes this because this is kind of like a watershed moment for the Israelites. This is the point where they are really moving in to the process of taking the promised land, because the next verses mention that all of the previous men, the men of the previous generation, have died. I just want to take a moment there, because I think we read that and we're like, yep, they're all dead, time to move on, and that's good news. But if we were to take the numbers that are given in the book of Numbers in the census at face value, which there are some discrepancies about, but if we just take it at face value, there's 603,550 men of fighting age. That's men 20 and over who leave Israel. Now there are a couple tests that give God some acts of disobedience where several of them, lots of them, die at once. A couple thousand at a time when, Korah rebels, and there's the golden calf. There's just times where a bunch of them die at the same time. But if we just average it out, we're talking about 600,000 men over for 40 years. That's averages 42 deaths a day. Now, it's a large community, but just think about that, an average of 42 people, and that's just the men. That is not the women. There's some dispute, because here he says just the fighting men, if women were included in the judgment or not. But 42 men on average are dying per day. That means death was the daily chore. It means mourning was the daily soundtrack. The Israelites should have been settling down with their families, enjoying the fruit of the land, and being properly buried in graves which their ancestors or their descendants could go and remember them properly, which was extremely important in the ancient culture. Instead, they were dying in the desert. Their bones were being left behind in sand graves. And the people whose population had exploded, so that they were 2 million when they left Egypt, and they had exploded in slavery, are now rapidly depleting in their freedom. Because think about it, we don't have anybody over the age of 60 in this community now, minus Moses. Oh, and Caleb and Joshua. So we have 3 men who are over the age of 60, but that's it. That generation had not been willing to work with Yahweh. They didn't have the faith that Yahweh would hold up his end of the deal. They didn't have a belief in his sovereignty, that when he said, this is what I'm going to do, come with me, that he was going to do it. And so Moses wants this next generation to have a firm grasp that God not only can give you what he promised you, he is the God of all the nations. So he can choose to take from one and give to the other at his discretion. We just have to go with him and believe it. Not engaging Moab and Edom was kind of a pretest, which they had passed, and now they're going to face an even greater challenge. which is the Amorites. And they're first, there's in two groups. There's King Sihon, who rules from Heshbon, and King Og, who rules from Bashan. And in verses 26 through 29, Moses offers the king of the Amorites the same deal as he had with the Moabites and the Edomites. And it's kind of ironic, well, not ironic, but it's funny because the Edomites and Moabites didn't actually accept Moses' terms. Like, he makes it sound like, and we offered them this deal, and then, we didn't bother them. He leaves out the part where, like, and they refused. But diplomatically, the end result is the same. Like, listen, we offered this to them, and they're fine now. Like, we haven't killed any of them. But King Sihon, what we are told in chapter 2, verse 30 is that, but Sihon, king of Heshbon, was not willing for us to pass through his land, for Yahweh your God hardened his spirit and made his heart obstinate. Had we been reading about the story of the Israelites up to this point, or if you are familiar with the story of the Exodus at all, that phrase is probably ringing off bells, that God has hardened his spirit and made his heart obstinate. Because we are told 14 times in the beginning of Exodus that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, or that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Both of them are used as the subjects who do the hardening. And so this language is very much replaying, reliving what happened in Exodus, which is where something happened. And it's like, okay, did Pharaoh harden his heart, or did God harden his heart? Well, the verbs that are used in here, the idea is a strengthening. So what is happening here is God is kind of, in his sovereignty, letting the Marines go. All right. This is what you want. This is what the leaders want. These are what these kings wanted. Pharaoh did not want to let the people go. And Sihon does not want to let the people go through, does not want to leave them unchallenged. He wants to defeat these people. And so God says, if this is what you want, I am giving you the agency to do it. I'm not going to restrain you. And so he is strengthened in his resolve because God does not weaken his resolve. It is a combination of agency where God is going to do this, but he knows exactly how that guy is going to respond. He knows exactly what that ruler wants, and he allows him to pursue his own desires until he has hardened his own heart by God's permissive will to the fact that he is going to create the conflict that will then give the Israelites their victory. And then we get to the more problematic part of the text. In fact, I would say, for me, maybe this is one of the more difficult parts of the Old Testament to deal with. Like, one of the more difficult things to struggle through and read is when you get to these sections in the conquest narrative, because what we are told is that, I didn't underline, the end of chapter 3, verse 34, we conquered all his towns and completely destroyed everyone, men, women, and children. Not a single person was spared. We took all the livestock as plunder for ourselves, along with anything of value from the towns we ransacked. And then in chapter 3, in verses 1 through 11, we are told that they did the same when they came to fight King Og of Bashan. So we've been talking about God's sovereignty, how he is the supreme God, how privileged position doesn't, give you special privileges. We also talked about how it requires some human agency, that God works in concert with that in his sovereignty. But what do we do when God's sovereign actions seem evil? We do not have time to go through an entire discussion of this, but it's going to keep coming up throughout Deuteronomy. And if you read on to Joshua, it will definitely come up. But we are going to do a brief outline. I have 5 points. I have 5 points. I'm going to go through them rather quickly. We can discuss it, but like I said, it's also going to keep coming up in the book of Deuteronomy as Moses is prepping the people to go and take over these lands. So these are 5. It is not an exhaustive list of ways what we can do. And it's specific to the conquest narratives. So this is not like an entire lesson on theodicy. This is not like, what do we do with the problem of evil? Or what do we do? We are not going to tackle all of that in the next 8 minutes I'm supposed to use. But first of all, I'm going to start with what I've said before, is that we believe that God is good, and therefore his purposes are good. We rest in the sovereignty of God. For some, they'll say that's all we need. But this is a difficult verse. And it really it is hard because it seems like God is ordering something that we also believe is antithetical to the message of the gospel, the message of the entire Bible, that all people are valuable. And the idea of killing women and children, this is the part that gets us. At least it gets me. I'm making assumptions for you as a group, just from what I know when we read through the Bible, and what bothers me. But we can't always discern the good, because we define good based on our cultural values. And the Israelites are discerning good based on their cultural values, which aren't necessarily biblical, godly values. The culture around them is swaying what they believe. The culture around us is swaying what we believe. Even when we say we're people of the book, I'm very biblical, we also know we live in a post-Enlightenment age. We live in a time of humanism. We live in a time of individualism. We live in a time where nations are given freedom and sovereignty. Our world is very different. And so how we define good is often so intermingled with our culture. And then we're trying to look at a foreign culture that is so intermingled with their culture and trying to discern what God is doing, the sovereign God who's actually looking all the way towards new creation in his purpose and plan. That is where that's going. We must reserve judgment on God and leave the benefit of the doubt to him. Just for example, even the Bible declares this as early as Genesis, when Joseph in chapter 50 declared that what his brothers meant for evil, God intended for good. Now, we are not saying that selling your brother into slavery is good. We are not saying that hating your brother, that you thought, oh, we did a good thing because we didn't kill him, also not good. Famine is not good. But God was working through all of it to get his people to Egypt so that he could save them from famine and save them from intermarrying the Canaanites. But that was just a means so that he could get them through a great act of deliverance. So he could get them to Sinai, so that he could get them to the promised land, so he can get kings to come up, so he can make a covenant with a king, so he can start a line that gets to David, so he can have a line that gets to Jesus, so he can raise Jesus from the dead, so we can become believers, so that he can bring the new covenant, so he can bring new creation. God is looking at new creation when we're looking at one verse. So we have to trust that I have no idea what's going on, but I can trust God. And that is harder for some than others, and I recognize that. But again, that's going to go back to last week. Write it down. Remember when he has been good. Remember when he's been good to others. Read his word, that he is always good. The second thing to remember when sovereign actions seem evil is that nations rise and fall according to his command. That's what we've been talking about, but what I mean is that like all nations rise and fall according to his command. Ancient nations, ancient people groups understood and assumed that their eventual destiny was destruction. Like, they would talk about lasting forever, but they didn't presume that their nation, their group, was going to last forever. We have ancient stories and tales of like the gods decreeing that this nation is over. It's hard for us to believe. We've had nations like China, which has survived through a dynasty, or monarchs like England. And the idea that like a country could cease to exist seems somewhat foreign, but we've seen it attempted recently. And in other less stable parts of the country, or less stable parts of the world, it does happen. And we have to remember that our country's like not even 300 years old. Like, we are a very young nation. That nations come and go throughout human history. I've been reading The Last Battle, is the last book in the books of Narnia, to my kids, and the line that popped in my head as I was writing this, as they say, like, Narnia's done, and the children are horrified by this idea, and they said, but only Aslan's land survives. Only the land of the king actually survives. Human nations are destined to rise and fall as God commands. Genesis 15:16 is a verse that's often pointed to that says, it's usually translated, the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure, which is an awkward English phrase because it's got some Hebrew phrases in it that everyone's like, we're not quite sure what to do with this. But when you look and take apart kind of the Hebrew phrases, especially the phrase not yet, which is a really bad translation of the idiom. The idiom means more like as it still is, or deferred. The idea is that when God is promising Abraham this land, and he's like, but it's not going to happen in your life because of this verse, whatever we take it to say, is that you can't possess it yet because their destruction, their destiny of destruction has been deferred until after your lifetime is over. And for Abraham, that actually would have been a comfort, because if you read the story of Abraham's life, the Amorites help Abraham. And so what he's being told is it's going to be your land, but also there's that part of him thinking like, so I'm going to displace people who have helped me save my people, who've been my friends and my allies. And so what God tells him is the Amorites, their kingdom is not forever. Their nation will not exist forever. They will rise and they will fall. And when the time for their destruction is no longer deferred, when it has come, they will be taken out. Which leads us to the third thing that we will briefly discuss, and that is a verb and a word that is used throughout the conquest narratives, and is the concept of cherem. So it's H, like the H, the Hebrew H, E-R-E-M. That's the noun version. It's what's used in Deuteronomy 2:34. It is one of the the words that if you look up in various English translations, like you're going to be like, what does this word mean? Because let's see, we can get completely destroyed, devoted to destruction. Like, what does it mean to be devoted to destruction? Are you destroyed? Are like, okay. Devoted to the ban. Okay, what's a ban? Like, you just can't come back. Also, put under divine judgment, or devoted to Yahweh. We have this wealth of, this plethora of definitions of translations because there is no English concept that translates that one word. But the idea behind it is that it is being set apart for holy use, that it is becoming Yahweh's personal property. John Walton, in his book, I think The Lost World of Conquest, defines the word cherem, or the concept, as the removal of something from human use. Meaning if this word haram, this verb, is done to something, it means it's no longer for human use. Humans can't use it, whatever the object is. Because the focus isn't on the object, but everyone around the object. No one can use this. The best illustration we can come up with is if you're in Joshua, from the Bible, in Joshua 9 maybe, after they destroyed Jericho, they go against the city of Ai. And it goes really terribly wrong. And they're like, what's going on? And it turns out this man, Achan, had taken a bunch of the cattle from the battle. But that cattle was supposed to be harammed. It was supposed to be completely destroyed, devoted to use, something. It was no longer, the point was, it's not for you to use. You can't take this for your use because it has been devoted. It has been put under this special protection or this special use permit for Yahweh alone. And when you took it, you took for yourself something that had been harammed, and then they are punished for that. So one method of making sure no one else can use something is to destroy it, to kill them. Also, though, sometimes they would take objects and put them in the temple treasury, or, the tabernacle at that point. But land can't be destroyed, so that would be given to the priests. The point is, as long as no humans were using it for their own purpose, it had been harammed. And in 2:26, God gives us this kind of wink, wink, nod, nod through the mouth of Moses that as they're about to go start defeating people, beginning today, I will make people throughout the earth terrified because of you. When they hear reports about you, they will tremble with dread and fear. Do you know what people do who are trembling with dread and fear that they're about to be killed? That someone's going to come and attack them? They leave. They flee. They get out of Dodge because, and a lot of times, we still see this to this day. When in Ukraine, the men were required to stay, and all the women and children were sent across the border. They were sent to Poland on trains with baby strollers waiting there to accept them. They had a heads up. So when we know that nobody was left there, it had been completely devoted. The word doesn't necessarily mean destroyed. Does that make sense? Like, it's just there are no people left living in this city. It is now under Yahweh's control to do with what he wants to do. In this case, he's going to lease it back to the Israelites to use, but it's still his city, not theirs. Another important point too is that when you get to the book of Joshua, you're given specific cities that are supposed to be harammed, but as we read through the text, we discover they're not all completely destroyed. So using the translation, completely destroyed, doesn't always give us the full picture and the accurate picture of what was done with every man, woman, and child. Also, in the conquest narratives, herem is not the general policy. So what is done to something, to a city or to a people group that are put under the ban, that are devoted to destruction, is not what is the general policy. And we're going to continue to see this, and you continue to see it, that like people groups that are completely destroyed aren't completely destroyed. Like they start, like, then you find one of them later in the Old Testament. And which leads into the fourth point, which is the genre of conquest. And that genre uses rhetorical language. We do this still in like sports talk. Like they annihilated them. They just creamed them. They crushed them. But we use annihilated a lot. We don't mean they annihilate, like they didn't kill them. Like they're not gone. They even still exist as a sports team. But it is a way of defining the success, of promoting the success. And rhetorical language is used when you have an agenda. And we have talked repeatedly that Moses has an agenda. This is not a history textbook. History, as we know it, does not even exist in the ancient world. Moses wants to make sure the people know that Yahweh had this great victory. He wants to inspire the current generation for the greater task of crossing the Jordan and continuing. And he also wants to provide authority and faith for future generations, that they will have something to remember, that they will have these great acts that Yahweh did. He annihilated them to rely on, just like, a coach. Someone might be like, you've got this coach. He helped annihilate that team last time. Look at the quarterback you got. Man, he just wiped the floor with those people. It is an inspiration to say, he made a victory, and to hype that victory as much as you possibly can, because they're going to face challenges in the future. And this is not to question biblical authority. Because the biblical authority is not in the representation of facts. Like, oh, they got that wrong. Oh, that's wrong. That point is wrong. They didn't wipe everybody out, so we can't trust the Bible. In my, the hermeneutic, the way I approach the text, the way when I read and try and get it, what does the Bible say? And what authority does it, like, where is the authority? Because I believe that it is authoritative for life and faith and practice. So I need to know where I get the authority. And that's with what the authors meant. We have two authors. We have God working through a human. So I need to try and figure out what Moses meant. What is Moses doing? So it is where we get the human author and what he's doing with the facts he's presenting. And in the conquest narratives, it is showing us that the promises of God were fulfilled and the purposes of God were furthered by giving Israel the land. That is the authoritative thing. That's what we can trust. That is what's proven out. There's no failure in that. So, I guess I'm going to get to that later on. It is not to deny the Bible to say they used rhetorical language. It is not to question the authority and the inspiration of scriptures to say, Moses used language to hype him up, because that's what Deuteronomy is about. Moses is trying to inspire this next generation. We will only feel deceived or that the Bible is being discredited if we insist on using our standards and instead of accepting the Bible as it is, and refusing to accept the Bible as it has been written and given to us by saying, oh, well, we have to accept that everybody was killed because that's what it says. If we refuse to accept that the Bible was written in an ancient concept of battle language, what we are really doing is it is an act of pride, and actually, I believe, a lack of disrespect for the scripture when we insist on it meeting our standards instead of saying, this has been given to me. It was not written for me. It was not written for my culture. It was not written for my time, but it was written for me, but it was not written to me, sorry. I mixed those up. That I can't force it to meet 21st century standards and genres and cultures. And in doing so, I actually show my own pride and arrogance that I know best, and that God was really writing directly to me, that this is for my culture. God had to write a scripture that was going to be relevant over thousands of years and historical and cultural periods around the globe. And when we try to force it into American or Western standards, we might just be proving again how much we center ourselves and not scripture in the conversation. The final thing, I know I've gone over, but I'm going to end with this quote. When sovereignty seems evil, what do I do? And I'm going to end with another quote from John Walton out of the book on the conquest, The Lost World of the Israelite Conquest. And it says this: God does not need to be defended. He wants to be trusted. If we believe that the ethics and the morality that are giving us pause in this text are the results of a Christian ethic, meaning like, I believe these certain things because I'm a Christian. Like, I believe that this kind of atrocity is wrong because of my ethics as a Christian. Then we have to trust that that has been born from the Spirit inside of us. And so when I go back and I read this and it bothers me, that's still God. And so I have to trust that the two won't be at odds. And even if I can't sort it out, we need to side with trusting in God. And that this is the same God at work in Deuteronomy as the God of mercy and grace that becomes flesh in Jesus. So we don't extinguish our horror when we read these texts, and we certainly do not accept this type of behavior as normative or prescriptive, that we get to go around killing carte blanche. We also do not dismiss or ignore it or reject it. We don't pretend like it's not there, or we're just not going to talk about it. We don't say, well, that's just a mistake. They just said that there really weren't any battles. There were. Moses isn't making that up. Like, Moses isn't making that up. He is adding some colorful language to hype the crowd up, but it happened. There was a battle. I guarantee you women and children were among those casualties. But what we do, either just saying, it's fine, God said kill him, let's kill him, or saying like, it didn't happen, it's just it's just made up fairy tales, legends, and myths. Both of those are acts of arrogance that claim, as the previous Israelite generation did, that spent their time wandering around the desert, that to be following God, it is an act of arrogance, both of those things, that claim that to be following God when we are really acting on fear and not faith. When we reject the scriptures out of hand, or we just can't understand it, so we're like, that's what we're supposed to do, we are claiming arrogance because we're scared. We're scared what it means to deal with it, and we're scared that maybe we can't trust God. And so we act in faith, we sit in the unease that we might have, we push in, we study the Hebrew, we study the culture, but we also study what God has done and what he is going to do. And we trust that in the in-between, when things don't settle right, he has always kept his promises, and we know that they are good, and we know that the new creation will be good, and that is what he is working towards. And so we take our fear, and instead of being arrogant and making and twisting scriptures so they fit what makes us feel better, we say, God, I can't always defend you, and you don't need me to, but I trust you.